Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gap between academics and practical marketing. Every week, we sit down and go deep behind the science of some of America's most successful brands. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today we're sitting with Adam Alter, professor of marketing at NYU's Stern School of Business and author of 3 best-selling books, Drunk Tank Pink, Irresistible, and Anatomy of a Breakthrough. Let's get into it. So, Adam, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands. Richard and I have made it our little mission to be on the hunt to learn about behavioral science, share behavioral science with our listeners, and really try to help improve marketing, advertising, and the world of consumer psychology. And we're thrilled to have you on the show today and to talk and to learn together. But before we get into our conversation, if you'll indulge me, let me give our listeners a little bit of background on you, and then we'll get into it. So, Adam, as we said, you're a professor of marketing at NYU's Stern School of Business with an affiliated appointment in psychology. And from all the research that you've talked about, Richard and I were talking, it sits at this intersection of psychology, behavioral economics, thinking about what affects people. And your 3 books give everybody a little bit of insight into each one, and then we can talk more about them throughout today. Drunk Tank Pink explores how unexpected forces shape how we think, feel, and behave. Irresistible dives into the hidden forces behind technology. And in my opinion, it's a super fascinating early look at how products are engineered to hijack our attention. I think it was probably at the very beginning of being concerned about screen time, and that's really changed the national conversation. And then in your latest book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough, you tackle this science of how to get unstuck, providing strategies for how to overcome creative and professional ruts. Beyond your writing, your TED Talk, born out of Irresistible and Why Screens Make Us Less Happy, has been viewed on TED over 4.7 million times. And you're a generous thought leader. You regularly share your thoughts in national publications, come on podcasts, and we're just thrilled to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, yes, of course, for us, you have listeners that come to the show because they don't know what they'll find, and part of this helping them think about how to uncover it is giving them the context and then also telling stories as we go. So one of the stories that we always start with is just, how did it all start for you? How did you get interested in consumer behavior? How did you get interested in the psychology behind decision making? Like, where does this begin for you in your life story?
So I actually talked about this in the third of the books you mentioned in Anatomy of a Breakthrough, which is about getting unstuck, because I was profoundly stuck as an undergrad at university. And I was studying actuarial science, which is not something that I saw myself doing for the rest of my life. But I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was interested in a lot of things. And so I spent 3 months sitting in as many first level or intro level courses as I could at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And the 2 courses that struck me were law and psychology. I sat in on 2 lectures that I thought were really interesting. And so I did both of those in parallel. You could do 2 degrees at the same time as an undergrad. And at the end of it all, I did an honors year and wrote a thesis in psychology. And I loved the research process. And I ended up applying to PhD programs in the US. One of them accepted me. And here I am, 21 years later.
That love of, as you look back on it, do you think those early interests in law and psychology kind of paved the way for research? To me, knowing little about law, a little more about psychology, but thinking about the academic research and then turning that into something usable, that's a skill set to do. But do you think that those early interests paved the way for it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's doing research for theory development, which is what you're supposed to do if you want to get tenure at a university, and that's what basic science is all about. And it's a pretty insular process. It's not really designed to be shared beyond the academic community necessarily. And then I think at some point a lot of people get itchy feet and say, I want this to be about more than just the paper that's being published and that's getting read 4 times, all 4 by my mother, that sort of thing. That happens to a lot of academics. And so that happened to me fairly early on. And I wanted to study something that I thought would have reach and importance beyond just the journal where it was written and that no one would read it. And so I always had an eye on, I wanted to do solid sound research, but I always had an eye on research that at least to me felt like it was in some way important.
And choosing to get unstuck, it's your third book, it's your most recent book, but it was an experience you had much earlier. So what took you from that first experience there to then writing Drunk Tank Pink? What was the story of how you got to that first book?
Yeah, I think a lot of academics in the last maybe 15 years in my field have written books. And that first book is often a sort of summary of what your career has been up to that point. And that's really what Drunk Tank Pink was for me. It summarized a lot of the research I'd been doing through my grad school career and then a little bit of my career as a professor because I wrote it fairly early on in that process. Um, and I had been studying. I realized when I look back on my body of work, I'd been studying how these sort of unexpected forces shaped how we think, feel, and behave, and that's what I turned the book into. That first book. Um, and I think that's common. And then what happens is if you really enjoy the book writing process and you feel you've got more to give and you want to write another book, then you have to figure out what comes next. Now, you could try to do a sequel, which a lot of people have done with some success. I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to do something quite different. And so then the second book became almost more of a journalistic exercise. It was a combination of my own research, but also figuring out some things that I didn't know rather than just a brain dump directly from what's in here down onto the page. And I love that process of combining the journalistic aspects with the original research.
Thank you for sharing that. So if we think about Drunk Tank Pink, if you look at the cover of the book, you got three swatches of pink on it, and I think the middle one is the name Drunk Tank Pink. That is the name of the color. But it starts to get into this discussion of how things that you don't think affect behavior actually do. Do you want to tell us the story behind the name of the book and that name of that color pink?
Yeah, the term drunk tank pink became an emblem for the kinds of effects that I found fascinating and that I wanted to study. So it was a color that was used in the late 70s and early 80s. Psychologists discovered that as they described it, you could paint the inside of a drunk tank or a jail cell this pink color and it would pacify whoever was thrown in there. So you'd get a rowdy, drunk or aggressive person, you'd put them in there, and 15 minutes later, the color had had this amazing effect on them, sapping their energy, making them much more compliant. And I was less concerned with whether that was true about the color than the fact that sometimes we don't realize that certain features in the world have an effect much greater than you would imagine. And that's what the book became about. It was an attempt to catalog some of these effects that that are, I think, quite surprising to lay people who don't recognize that they're out there, having constant little pushes and pulls on the way we experience the world.
Richard and I have often referred to the concept of nine enders in different discussions we've had, in different shows we've had, and some one of your most famous studies covers this. So talking about things you don't think affect a your decision making process, could you first explain the concept of nine enders and then what your study found in this?
Yeah, this is some work I did with my colleague and very good friend Hal Hirschfield, who's at UCLA. We started doing this research maybe 2012 or 2013. And I remember we sat down in Hal's office. He was at NYU at the time before he moved to UCLA. And I said to him, I remember when I ran a marathon. I've only run one marathon. I will probably only ever run one marathon. But I remember what spurred me to run it was I was 29 and I felt like I was staring at this new decade that was about to begin. And I needed to do something. I needed to create some sort of meaning in my life to show myself that I was kind of vibrant, alive, engaged. I felt the passage of time. And it changed how I felt and thought and behaved in that year. And I remember thinking about that and wondering whether that was an unusual experience. And if you think about it, there should be no real difference materially between 29, 28, 30, 27, 31. Like they're all sort of a year within each other. And that as you tick over to a new year, there shouldn't be a good reason why aging should be different or the experience of aging should be different between, say, 28, 29 versus 29 and 30. But there is something very pressing about being 29, 39, 49, 59. And Hal and I discussed it and we realized that seemed true to us, to both of us. Um, And so what we wanted to do is to examine whether people, when they are these nine ending ages, as we call them, ages where you're an adult, where you're about to hit a new decade, whether that might spur different ways of thinking about the world. And it seems that it does. So we have evidence, and there's actually been some replication of these effects in other papers, showing, for example, that if you track how much people consider the meaningfulness of their lives across time, there is a little spike in the nine ending years, which indicates that people kind of do an audit of their lives. They zoom back during these years and try to figure out, has my life been meaningful? Has this sense of the passage of time is spurring me to think about my life in a much more abstract, broad way. And that can lead to good things and bad things. You can conclude that, yes, my life is meaningful. I'm happy where I am. Perhaps I just want to remind myself of what's important to me. Or you could have a crisis of meaning where you feel that perhaps life hasn't been all you want it to be. And so we found, based on my initial example, that there is a big spike in people who run marathons at nine ending ages. And actually at zero ending and eight ending as well, there's a little sort of peak of a wave, a kind of crescendo, and then it declines again in the middle of the decade. So people running first time marathons, running their fastest marathons, that tends to happen at those ages. But then on the negative side, you see, we got data from an online dating site that is for people who are looking for extramarital affairs.
Ashley Madison, I think.
Ashley Madison, yeah, you see a big spike in nine ending ages on that site too. Part of the reason that might be happening is because people are lying about their ages, which you can't be sure is not true. But also, there is a notable spike in these nine ending ages. Um, and then you also, this is obviously a much graver statistic, but you see a spike in suicide rates as well at the nine ending ages, which is obviously the sort of the greatest version of a crisis of meaning that you might have in life. And so some of these effects are funny, trivial. Some of them are obviously not at all. They're pretty serious. But all of this reflects this idea that at this nine ending age, you notice the passage of time, and it makes you much more thoughtful and introspective about the nature of your life.
I think it's an absolutely fascinating study, and I think the creativity of those data sets you analysed is amazing. Have you found that companies or businesses or people trying to change behaviour, have you seen practical uses of your in-house principle?
Yes, I have actually a few times. And if you think about it, if you think about what the mechanism is, there are some businesses that want you to do what seems to happen quite naturally at that nine ending age. They want you to think about the passage of time. They want you to feel that time is slipping away, perhaps as you get higher up in age and nine ending ages. And they want you to be more thoughtful about meaningfulness. And where you see this in particular is businesses that are focused on sacrificing what's going on now for the greater good in the long run. And so I've seen it most with insurance companies and with investment companies. So these are two organizations where I'm telling you that you have a certain amount of money today, and I'd like you to not spend that money, although I'm sure there are lots of things you could do with it today. I'd like you to put it aside. And it's going to be for your legacy, or it's going to be for when you've retired, or it's going to be for your kids after you're gone, or whatever. But in each case, there's something bigger than just you here now today. And I think that happens naturally at those nine ending ages. So those are the companies that pay attention to that. But there's another way to use this. It's not just going up to people who are 29, 39, 49, 59. If you understand the psychological mechanism at play there, all that's doing is sort of tipping you more into the realm of saying, who am I? Where am I? What's life like? How do I feel about my life across time? And so what that does is I've seen this used by insurance companies where they have a sort of script, and also by investment companies, retirement investment companies. And they turn it into a kind of script where you put people in the mindset that we naturally seem to adopt at these nine ending ages. So you basically say, um, what's the most important thing to you? Who are you going to be in 20 years? How do you feel about, like, if I had to ask you to sum up in one sentence, what is the meaning of your life, or what are the most sort of meaningful aspects of your life, or what do you think you'll be doing the first 5 years after you retire? Anything that makes you think in this very grand big way transports you forward and makes you think more abstractly and more broadly, and I think leads to the same kinds of outcomes.
With the that first example you talked about, was this a case of insurance companies targeting 29, 39, 49 year olds, or was it both a combination of messaging and targeting?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. So what they what they told me they were doing was When you obviously know, one of the first things you know about someone when you're talking to them as an insurance agent is what their age is. So what they started to do was, if the person's age was, I think they were using 8, 9, and 0. So you don't have to only focus on nine enders. I know that's what we focus on, but it's the same idea. Some people get that same feeling when they're approaching the end of the decade, and at 38, 48, 58. Some people, it actually only happens once you tip over into the next decade. So when you're 40, 50, 60. And so when they found people who were of those ages, they would ask certain questions like, I noticed that you are approaching a new decade, or you've just entered a new decade. What has that made you think about your life? Did you think more deeply about your life? So it was just a little sort of lever to push them in that direction. But you don't need that, right? You could take a 34-year-old and say, you're 34, you're not in your 20s anymore, and you're not yet 40, but I'm sure you think a little bit about occasionally, what would it like to be 40, and perhaps even one day to retire. So it's the first sentence or two in a conversation. I think it just kind of makes a very natural jump into that kind of conversation.
Nine Enders was a very famous bit of research that you and Hal Hershfield did. And another area that an awful lot of research on is about the way that the label that we give a behaviour can change people's interpretation of it. And you've got this amazing knack for a brilliant phrase. In one of your New Yorker articles, you talk about the linguistic Heisenberg principle. Could you talk about what you mean by that?
So the basic idea, the Heisenberg principle, I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is that basically I think you can only measure the speed of an object or know its location at any moment in time. And once you sort of fix it down to figure out where it is, you can't see how fast it's traveling because it's fixed. And the linguistic Heisenberg principle is this idea that concepts in the world, objects, ideas, are not fixed in the same way as an object that you can pin down and you're trying to figure out its speed is not fixed. It's kind of, it's eerie and difficult to get your hands on. And this is what I noticed about the way labeling worked, that um, we sort of have this idea that there is a true state or form of a thing, but once you change what you call it and how you refer to it, you change the thing. And there are some great examples of this. Much of this is based on the work of Lera Boroditsky at Stanford. And she talks in one of her papers about the fact that the word for bridge, like a bridge that spans across, two parts across the side of a river, the word for bridge in Spanish is masculine, and the word for bridge in German is feminine. And if you ask German speakers and Spanish speakers, tell me, if you imagine a bridge in your mind and tell me what words come to mind. Because in German, bridge is a feminine word, German speakers will tell you that the bridge is elegant. They'll use words that are typically feminine. When you ask a Spanish speaker, just naturally describe a bridge, they'll use robust, strong, and they'll use much more typically masculine words. Um, and the argument there is obviously that there is no such thing as a masculine bridge or a feminine bridge, but the way you think of the bridge is through a lens that's shaped by your language, by whatever terms you give it. And if it's a masculine term, you think of it as masculine. If it's feminine, you think of it as feminine. And there are lots of other examples of this. There's this very, very famous study looking at eyewitness memory, where you're asked how fast a car was going. And if the two cars in this shot, you see this very brief video clip, which you can find on YouTube, and it's two cars colliding, or a car collides into some other object. I can't even remember, speaking of the fallibility of memory. Um, but this car has a collision, and you're either asked, how fast was the car going when it collided, or how fast was the car going when it smashed, and various other words that vary in intensity. Now, if you're in a courtroom and you're asking an eyewitness how fast was the car going, and you use the word collided, that sounds pretty tame. But if you say smashed, there's an image of broken glass, and it's a sort of violent word. And people imagine that the car was going much faster when they're asked how fast it was going when it smashed. They saw exactly the same video footage, but that word changes what they saw and how they perceive that same event. And so that's this Heisenberg principle, that nothing is actually truly fixed. It's largely governed by how you refer to it and what you say when you're talking about it.
And your original interest in this maybe even colored by your background is in law, and this could have a big difference on how the jury thinks of this of this situation. Even though it was all the car collision was happening at the same speed, it was only the adjective that changed. Have you seen this applied commercially? Like where brands have used language to be more persuasive, or practical ways communicators have used this to convince people of things?
Everywhere. I mean, any copy there is, I think you'll find the way real estate listings are a perfect example of this. You know, a home, when you see a home and you're trying to sell a home for millions of dollars, if it's a luxury home, everything in there is gloss, essentially. You know, you're trying to imagine, if I walk into a home and you're trying to sell it to me and it's an expensive home, I have to imagine lots of things simultaneously and very quickly. I have to imagine myself living there. I have to imagine that it's mine. I have to imagine enjoying it with people I love. But I also have to feel that it's special and it's a luxury home and it's different from what else is out there and it's unique. And so all of the language that you see in listings, and I do this constantly. I comb the listings in the United States in various areas just to see the way real estate agents are now describing homes. And I first got very interested in this in the real estate context when I was selling an apartment that I had in New York City. And I was working with my real estate agent to craft what was going to be online as the description. And I watched that process and it was alchemy. It was amazing. I was like, but this, it's a shoebox in Manhattan. She's like, it's not a shoebox, it's a palace. I was like, oh, it's a palace. And she's like, you could have been in a much smaller place. It could have been 200 square feet, but look at your 300 square foot palace. I was like, 50% more than 200 square feet. You're right. It is a palace. So, so, so yeah, I think brands use this all the time. If you think about packaged goods, it's on the label almost all the time as well. And brand naming as well is the same. So yeah.
The most extreme category I've seen doing this again and again and again is bizarrely fish fish salesmen. So there are examples of the Patagonian toothfish. No one wanted to buy it in the 1970s. Lee Lance calls it the Chilean sea bass. The dolphin fish, no one wants to eat it because, you know, who wants to eat something that reminds you of Flipper, became mahi mahi. There's mud bugs, I think were renamed as, is it crawfish? Is that how you say it in America? Yeah. And it's such an extreme change again and again.
And for the listeners, I think the application takeaway of this part of the conversation is: do you have a vision of what you want your buyer to imagine it being? Richard and I often find in our conversations that sometimes small businesses or real estate agents who are on the street are more used to doing these psychology principles than corporate marketers, because if you're a brand manager of a Fortune 100 or Fortune 1000 company, you've got a few barriers to you and the customer. But if you're selling real estate every day, very quickly you start to say, how can I imagine this shoebox as a palace? And you start to apply these principles. So I think one of the takeaways is just how do you as a marketer, an advertiser, a brand owner envision what the best state to sell it would be, or imagine the best way to get people to live a healthier life? It doesn't just have to be selling. Marketers and advertisers do health campaigns. We do lots of things to make the world a better place. So how can we help them imagine that best state? I think is one of the takeaways we can think about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think um, these ideas often, they're not that surprising on their face. Like the idea that what you call something is important. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about the name I wanted to give my child because I realized it's an important thing to do. I think where it becomes interesting and really valuable and practically important is to how you instantiate it, how you use it, and what you do with it. And there are some people who are very good at that. They translate the ideas into something practical. I think the example Richard gave with the fish is a perfect one. That these fish all look the same when they come to you on they're raw fish. You're in the fish shop and you're like, I don't know, there's just a whole lot of different fish. I don't know what I'm looking at. But that instantiation has made maybe millions or billions of dollars for fisheries everywhere. So um, I think that's exactly right. The process is, how do you turn this insight into something valuable? And there is a whole way of doing it: the brainstorming process, discussing it with other people, figuring out what the end state should be, what is the goal I'm trying to achieve with it. I think that's exactly right.
So within the world of language, one of the areas you've done an awful lot of research on is this principle of fluency. Could you describe what you mean by that and why businesses should be interested?
Yeah, this is the subject of probably more of my research than any other topic. Fluency is essentially how easy it is to make sense of a piece of information. And it could be written information, it could be visual, it could be something that you're thinking about in memory. And every single time your brain tries to make sense of information in the world, it falls along a continuum from very, very easy or very fluent to very, very difficult or very disfluent. So if you're just learning to speak a new language, every single word that you bring to mind will be disfluent, it'll be difficult, it will require considerable attention. But if you're speaking the language you spoke when you were first learning language, it's very fluent. You don't even think about it, it's borderline automatic. And that's very fluent. And what I've studied with mostly with my colleague Danny Oppenheimer, who was one of my advisors when I was doing my PhD, is what does this matter? What does the fluency or disfluency of a particular instance of communication matter? We found in one of our early studies, this was published almost 20 years ago now, that if you look at the performance of stocks on the stock market or shares on the share market, depending on which part of the world you're in, um, when the share is first released at IPO, if you can pronounce its name fluently, or if it has a ticket code that is pronounceable as an English word, if it's in an English speaking country, it will get a much bigger IPO pop or bounce over the first day to week of its trading, which will then revert back to a sort of mean level after 6 to 12 months. But people feel a sense of comfort. They feel like the stock is less risky when they feel they understand it, they can pronounce it, it feels familiar and fluent. And fluency therefore matters a lot in a lot of domains where you're essentially trying to sell something new to people who are trying to figure it out from zero acquaintance. They don't know anything about it, and then they're like, "What is this thing?" And so fluency helps you get over that initial hump.
When you say that, it does strike me as crazy that pharma companies who spend billions of pounds on launching medication, often the names are a collection of consonants. It's very, very hard to pronounce. You would have thought that they would be all over this research and giving, simple, fluent names to reduce the perception of risk.
Pharma naming is a huge business. So in the United States, there are all the kind of consonant filled Rizamumab or something, and you're like, I have no idea how to deal with that. But that's the generic name. But then when you look at the branded name will be both very fluent, largely fluent, or if it's disfluent with a purpose. And so it's trying to tell you that there's an attribute associated with this product. You're not allowed to use a real word because that's not allowed in the naming conventions legally, but you can make it sort of evoke ideas that are associated with whatever concepts you want people to think about with that drug. So if it's a drug that's supposed to calm you versus a drug that's supposed to excite you and make you alert, you're going to have a completely different set of names that are going to work in those contexts. So there are two aspects to naming. There's the fluency, but then the other aspect is semantics. What meaning is inspired by the name, and you can play those two together and kind of separately. And pharma naming involves a lot of that. It's a very, very complex process.
I worked on an asthma brand, and Allegra was one of the competitors. And always and forever, Allegra had an A at the start of its name, and Allegra felt airy. It felt like it was relieving your asthma symptoms. And so, just to double down on this on your concept, working on the teams that were working on it, that was the name really meant a lot.
Although that example does show the variance by culture, because I think there was a car of not particularly fancy attributes called the Allegra in Britain. So I think a Brit seeing it would have thought, why have they named it after this kind of mid-market, old-fashioned car? So the danger of different fluencies or different semantic associations across different cultures.
To the beginning of your point, Adam, that's I think exactly like what's fluent in English is if it's my first language, if it takes a lot of effort, it may be totally different, and so cultural relevance. And again, to the pharma space, they use different brand names in different countries. So the same drug gets a different brand name depending on where it is. So let's break apart the idea of fluency and disfluency because I think there's probably interesting things to talk about on both sides. So we let's take the initial learning as fact. If we can have more fluency. It gives you more comfort. It's more believable. You're more likely to buy the stock. You're more likely to feel comfort with the brand. So, how can communicators increase their fluency? What are tactics they can use to be more fluent with their target audiences?
I think there's some obvious low hanging fruit for everyone. You're in an industry and there's a gap of knowledge between whatever you're doing and whatever the receiver knows, the receiver of that information or the audience. So jargon is obviously a problem. You don't want any jargon. You want to be as straightforward as possible. A lot of fluency is about stripping down the language so that it's as simple as possible. So I think that's a good first place to begin is simple copy editing. If you have a script or something that approximates a script, make it as simple and straightforward as possible. I think in the world of sales, I've talked quite a lot with people who try to automate as much as possible. So fluency can also be about just requiring people to make fewer decisions and to take fewer actions. So if you have a process and a lot of, again, going back to insurance or financial services, you might have 10 things that need to be worked through with any potential customer. But are they all essential in that first conversation? Are there some that you can gather information behind the scenes? So, what's your age? What's your date of birth? If people are going to be filling that out elsewhere, can you just pipe that in? And even stripping down the whole process so that it's 50% quicker and involves 50% fewer questions, that has a huge effect on the fluency of the interaction. I think also a lot of it is about curation. So when you present options to people, really, really smart salespeople will curate the options. They won't just present them in a sort of totally objective way. They'll either suggest that something is the most common option that people choose, or for someone like you, these are the reasons why this might make the most sense, but perhaps you've got other considerations, in which case this other option would be valuable to you. And so I think a lot of it is in the way you curate and present the information, and stripping it down and making it as simple as possible for people is great. Now in the United States, we really privilege this idea of kind of liberty and freedom, and there's this assumption that people want infinite decisions so that they can really tailor their world to whatever they specifically need. But you will absolutely overwhelm people if you don't make things more streamlined, narrower, funnel them. And so you really have to do that, I think, and that's where fluency comes from.
Yeah, I mean, that last point as marketers to not just give three great options, but to label them and curate them so that even though you can look at all the benefits, even though you can compare on price, this is what's most common in your area. This is what's most common for people at your life stage, or however you label them helps just ease that burden of thinking through it and increases fluency. It's super helpful, but not always is it best to increase fluency? And you have a paper entitled The Benefits of Cognitive Disfluency. So, what's the instances where we don't want to actually remove all the friction, where we don't want to have like as most fluent communication as possible?
Yeah, so I think with a lot of areas of research, you get a couple of decades of people showing in 50 different ways that one thing is good. And then at some point, people say, but what are the boundaries? Where does that end? And when is that not true? And so, again, with Danny Oppenheimer, we started doing some research on this again about 20 years ago, looking at, well, actually, surely there are times when it's good to be disfluent. When might that be? And one of the things disfluency does is it signals to you that you need more resources to make sense of the situation. Like if I'm learning a new language, my brain automatically works much harder to do that process, to go through that process. And so if I want you to pay great attention to the thing I'm about to say now, if I hit you with a little burst of disfluency, then your brain will say, well, hang on, something's going on here. And it's going to engage deeper resources. So we have a series of studies showing that when you present people with, say, something that's written in a font that's hard to read, they do much better if after that they're asked some intellectual questions. They do better at those questions. They get them right more often. And so essentially what you're doing is you're slowing the brain down. You're saying you've got to recruit additional resources. Now, you don't want to do that all the time because people will be overwhelmed and they'll be exhausted by it. But strategically, if you place these moments of disfluency and you punctuate otherwise fluent conversation with disfluency, those are the moments when the person will kind of perk up and say, oh, this is something I really need to pay attention to. So that's one example of a benefit.
That idea that a little bit of effort gets information, stuck in the mind is interesting because if you think one of the big changes the last year is ChatGPT, which removes friction in terms of researching topics. I think there's uh, early studies, not replicated yet, but suggest people researching with ChatGPT remember less than if they've had to Google them or go to a book and find things out themselves. So that idea of friction not always being a negative is fascinating.
Yeah, this idea of cognitive alarm bells is really interesting to me. This idea that disfluency is essentially a kind of alarm bell that says it's time to pay more attention. So your cognitive skills need to be at their best. And it's funny you mentioned GPT. There are some examples now of, for example, lawyers who will file briefs with made up citations, and then they won't check what they're doing because the whole process is so fluent. You say, ChatGPT, tell me, here's what my case is about. Can you give me 10 cases that are relevant? Maybe some literature, some articles that have been written in journals. You lift that, you paste it in, and it all looks right. You even recognize some of the names there. The titles of the papers make sense to you. You can almost remember having read some of them, but essentially they're fabricated. They're hallucinations. And so I think this is what happens when you have arch fluency. You have so much fluency that you stop being critical of anything, and then you run into a lot of trouble. And there are lawyers who've been disbarred as a result of submitting briefs that are basically wholly made up.
It's a it's an amazing moment we're in because the technology has, as you say, they could have sworn they read it. They're almost certain they knew that study. And so I heard somebody speak recently about like humans hallucinate too. So before we give like a ton of critique to the AI, humans are fallible, and so is the AI. And so when you have that overlapping of it's too high fluency, too high of a sense of confidence that the data is right. So as you call it, arch fluency, you stop being critical, and you have a hallucination or the data's not right. It's a dangerous end of the pool to be in.
Yeah, exactly.
A while ago, you did a series of pieces for the New Yorker. And in one of them, you start with this amazing anecdote about a salesperson selling genuine Banksies, but not being able to get any cash. And it leads you to this idea that there are certain products that are, in your words, inherently invaluable. Could you take us through maybe that anecdote and then the underlying thinking behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this work is work that was originally done by Chris Shee. The term inherently invaluable is Chris Shee's work, and I was applying it to this fascinating case. This was, I think, the summer of 2013, and Banksy, the performance slash street slash political artist. I assume Banksy's one person who really knows. Banksy was doing essentially what was called a residency in New York City for the month of July of 2013, I think it was. So for every day in July 2013, a new Banksy would be revealed overnight somewhere in the 5 boroughs of New York. And I remember chasing them around, and I liked Banksy a lot. And so I would go look, and some of them happened to be fairly near where I was. And one of the works, the one that had the biggest impact on me, was that Banksy had wanted to sort of critique the art world and the way the art world worked. And so what he, she, it, they did, who knows what we're dealing with here, um, was to have these genuine Banksy works that were worth tens of thousands of dollars each, sold on the side of Central Park. Now there's a whole line of artists and artisans who sell various things there. And one of the stalls was these genuine Banksy works, and there was an elderly gentleman who'd been paid to stand there from I think 10 to 5 or something like that. And someone was filming this whole process. And people would walk by. These works were advertised as being sold for $40 to $60 each. And I think the first sale took 3 hours to happen, and someone bought 2 of these works. Now, if you think about what that person did, this person spent, I think they bargained him down from $60 a work to $40 a work. So they spent something like $80, walking away with $100,000 of value, something like that. And at the end of the day, this guy had sold a few of the works. And actually, some people had said, I walked by and I realized that someone was ripping off Banksy's. And this person clearly, as a lover of Banksy, couldn't distinguish between the real thing and not the real thing. And the commentary here from Banksy was someone somewhere has decided that these things were worth $100,000 each on the open market, on the art market, because they're genuine Banksys. But also, regular people seeing the very same thing could not perceive $40 of value in them. So what's going on here? What is art? It's It's a confection. It's just nonsense. And he was basically saying this world that we've created for ourselves, some things like the value of a loaf of bread to a hungry person, there's something very grounded about that. That's inherently evaluable. When I'm hungry, when I'm thirsty, when I'm too hot, when I'm too cold. But actually, so much of the value we see in the world, especially in the developed world, is essentially just nonsense. It's hot air. And he was just showing that in a very extreme way by showing that these same works could be worth at the same time, simultaneously, less than $40, but also more than $100,000.
And is that something? I mean, there's the art world, which is quite an extreme, and then you say at the other end there's kind of commodities like bread or grain. Is there a zone in between where big consumer goods can apply this principle? I think you might have even talked about beer as being inherently invaluable.
I think 99% of the things sold today are inherently invaluable. I don't think there is a true canonical value to almost everything that's sold today. And so the act of selling is turning your artwork into the Banksy, the genuine Banksy, rather than the $40 one that sits on the side of the street and isn't sold. So yes, beer is a great example of this. People will pay huge amounts for certain kinds of beers, and the labeling is part of it, and the breweries are part of it. Certainly, there are people who are able to distinguish the taste of a good beer from a bad beer, and the same for wine. But most of us have no idea, and so we're paying attention to all the wrong cues. And I think this is true in so many domains. It's true about political decision making as well. We are very superficially swayed by cues that have almost nothing to do with policy making and what will actually end up affecting us. And so it's whether it's a human that you're trying to sell, whether it's policies, whether it's packaged goods, whether it's luxury goods, it doesn't really matter. I think almost everything is susceptible to these kind of framing effects that change how valuable you think the thing is.
Connecting an idea I've heard you speak about in other podcasts and other places, less fluent brand names like premium products, Lamborghini sports car, hard to pronounce, doesn't feel like English. How does that connect to this conversation that we're having? How does sometimes disfluency increase perceived value?
Yeah, so fluency feels familiar, it feels comfortable, it feels easy, which is all the opposite of what luxury should be. So if I'm selling an everyday thing and I want you to feel comfortable about it, I want you to think it's not very risky, then I'm going to use fluent language. But if I want you to think this thing is exotic and it's special and it's out of the realm of what's ordinary, then especially disfluency that's tied to foreignness, when the foreignness it's a place that's aspirational, that works very well. So in fashion, that might be France, it might be Italy. In wine, it might be France or Spain or Italy. Um, and it can be made up. I mean, the classic example of this is the Brooklyn-based ice cream company Haagen-Dazs, which a lot of people have probably heard that story, but it's the perfect example of this because Haagen-Dazs is, when you ask people what's the origin of the name Haagen-Dazs, they all say something like it's vaguely European. And then you say, so an ice cream from Europe, why would Europeans know a lot about ice cream? It's a place that's generally colder than other places. And then they say that's a fair point, but they know their ice, right? So maybe they know their ice cream too. They know cold stuff. And so it's not clear exactly what the value of it is, but it sounds like a luxury brand. But actually, the way that name is constructed, there is no language in the world that uses those letters in that order. And so it was just made up to say this is a luxury ice cream. It's meant to make you think generically of Northern Europe, perhaps, or Eastern Europe. I'm not sure exactly what it implies. It's different things to different people. But yes, it's the name has that effect in that case.
Well, the original packaging that they put together had a little map of Denmark in. So they were
Oh, it was Danish. Okay.
yeah, they had never been to Denmark. They had no idea about Denmark. Supposedly, I think it was Ruben Mattus was the founder. Him and his wife were both Jewish, and he thought that Denmark had a particularly positive record during World War II of helping the Jewish population evade the Nazis. So there was some kind of love of the country from that way. And then I think thought the European values in the 1940s sounded quite exotic to New Yorkers. So as you say, just completely made up this word with fake umlauts and a little map to bemuse people.
And this was a case where he could have chosen the most fluent name in the world. He could have found a name that was very fluent and instead added, as you say, the umlauts and it obviously was designed to look foreign and different and disfluent. And so there, I think you do get the value of disfluency implying luxury.
I think we've seen here already from like the Banksy and other stories. You've got this great gift of finding an anecdote that explains a psychological finding. Of all the anecdotes across your three books, the one that I found kind of most shocking was around heroin addiction during the Vietnam War. Could you run through that finding and then how that relates to habits?
Yeah, this is a study that I think, or a phenomenon that I think illustrates the power of field experiments. That so often we as researchers go out and do these very careful experiments in the lab. And there's huge value in doing those kind of gold standard experiments where you're very carefully manipulating factors and you're seeing what the outcome of that manipulation is on some sort of measured variable. But this was a really interesting case. So there was a lot of research done on heroin addiction in the early part of the 20th century. And the research generally found that relapse rates among people who are trying to stop using heroin were very, very high. That if you had been a heroin user and then you managed to detox, there was about a 90% plus chance. So more than 9 in 10 heroin users would go back to heroin. So not only was it very difficult to detox, but then once you detoxed, you were very likely to return to it. Now, during the Vietnam War, a lot of American troops would have a lot of downtime. And a lot of people don't recognize or realize this about the experience, but there would be months and months where sometimes nothing was happening. It was an incredibly boring experience. And so they'd go out and try to find something to do to entertain themselves. And there were a lot of drugs available to them, a lot of opioids, and there was a lot of heroin available. So a lot of these troops, when they were stationed in Vietnam and were not back in the United States, developed very, very serious heroin addictions and dependencies. And so there was this big worry in the United States that when they returned, there'd be this huge public health crisis. You'd be landing these people with a heroin addiction back in the States. They'd have to figure out how they were going to deal with this. And then, of course, given the 90% relapse rate, you were going to be in a lot of trouble because most of them would have these very long-term problems that would follow. But what actually happened was when they returned to the United States, the relapse rates were less than 10%. So this is an incredible gulf, right? Most heroin users, 90% relapse rate. Heroin users coming back from the Vietnam War, less than 10%. And so the question then becomes, backward engineering this, what is the difference between these soldiers in Vietnam who are getting addicted to heroin and most people who get addicted to heroin who have high relapse rates? And what they realized was that you don't inherently return to heroin. What happens is you reinstate the context where you did it. So if you're in a city and you use heroin and then you learn how not to use it, you detox, you probably spend time with the same people when you used to use it, who you used to spend time when you used it. You probably spend time in the same places. Your life hasn't changed in material ways. It is exactly the same life minus the heroin. And so you're constantly being reminded of it and it's being inspired for you. And all the problems and complexities of your life that may have led you in the direction of using heroin are still present. And so you see you see that 90% relapse rate. For these soldiers in Vietnam, the context in which they used heroin, they were bored, they had not much to do, they didn't have a lot of social support, they were far away from family, from friends, from loved ones, from a steady job, and so on. But once they landed back in the US, nothing was the same. The context was entirely, entirely different. And so there was no context reinstatement. So the study basically showed that it wasn't that humans are just inherently susceptible to heroin relapsing or reuse. It's that if you put someone in a context where you have everything but this one ingredient that was such a big part of their lives, that ingredient will be a part of their lives again very, very quickly. But if you change the context dramatically, you're much less likely to relapse. And so it changed the way people treated drug addiction. It basically meant that the best thing you could do was to move in different circles, spend time with different people to the extent possible, move to a new place if you could, get a new job if you could, just change as much about your life as you can that has nothing to do with the heroin. And then the addiction relapse rates will be much lower.
Absolutely fascinating. 'Cause I think there's so much you can apply outside of that specific situation, maybe ironically, of heroin addiction. That there is a misnomer, a misbelief that if you want to change behavior, it's all about motivation. Whereas this suggests alongside that, you've got to think about environmental cues and triggers, and changing that should go alongside any acts of motivation building.
Yeah, I think the narrow response to that is context matters a lot, and the broad response is um, it's just sometimes very, very difficult to figure out what's driving any effect, and sometimes it takes these natural experiments, these natural shifts, where it just so happens that certain people experience different outcomes, having been exposed to different situations, to realize the power of a particular cue on behavior.
And you need people willing to look broadly at what occurred to decode it, because it would be very easy. There's a lot of different rationale that could be applied to why returning soldiers from Vietnam didn't relapse, but it requires a broad view of what's going on to evaluate it, which is a big takeaway for all of the listeners here. Particularly for brand marketers and brand advertisers, they're thinking only about their brand, only about their buyer, only about the moment they want to purchase, and they want a behavior to be different, stop smoking, better safe driving, wear seatbelts, and actually there's a whole lot more context, Adam, to your narrow point. There's a whole lot more else going on. And so how can we understand the wider world that we play in to make sure that we can be effective? So this has been a lovely conversation. We've covered a lot of topics, but before we come to a close, um, we wanted to ask you one final question. From all of your research and all of your thinking to date, is there one concept that you wish more marketers understood more, or a concept that you wished you saw applied more in commercial applications, and maybe why?
I think the single most powerful idea that cuts across a lot of contexts is that when you're selling a product, or it doesn't matter what the product is, it can be a service, a good, an idea, it doesn't matter what it is. I think we try to sell the thing, the actual thing, and forget that everything you're selling is essentially, if it's going to be sold, it's because it has a sort of core to that product that is a psychological need that is met by that product. And we often try to sell the flashy car because it looks nice and it's got a good engine and all this sort of stuff that's extraneous to the actual reason why the person's buying it. I think the thing to figure out first with every single product, and this really should begin before you design and think about trying to even market or make a product, is what psychological need is it meeting, and how do you describe it in a way that aligns with that psychological need? And it's not about flashiness, it's not about luxury, it's not about any of that stuff. It's what are the kind of deep either insecurities or values or attitudes or beliefs or needs that a person has. If you can figure that out, you're like 90% the way to selling the thing. And I think a lot of people bypass that process, and that is old school psychology, that we don't buy or use anything unless it's meeting some psychological need. And I think Apple, for example, has historically done a very good job of this. Some other brands have done a good job, but Apple's been especially good at figuring out what are those psychological needs and how do you make products that scratch those itches.
It's a lovely final message to leave everybody on, because it's a challenge and a call for us to all think more about. Thank you, Adam, for the conversation. Like we do each week, all of the big topics and studies and concepts that we discussed in this week's show will be in the show notes. If you liked the conversation that you had, please leave a comment, share an idea, or share this video with others that are passionate about psychology and marketing. And until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Adam, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Recognized as one of the fastest growing companies in America for the third year in a row, featured on Inc.'s 5,000 list. Method One is a proudly independent creative and media agency grounded in behavioral science. They exist to make brands irresistible, helping people discover products, services, and experiences that bring moments of joy to their lives. As behavior change experts, Method One creates emotional connections that drive true brand value for their clients, focusing primarily with indulgence brands in the CPG space. Find out more at methodone.com.